So much has happened in South Africa, certainly in the last 2 months or so, particularly centered around, COVID-19 and the concerns, the real concerns we have around our health and the health of just about everybody, not just in South Africa, but around the world watching in terms of what happens now and in the future. Two people, however, besides the President of South Africa and the Minister of Health, who have played a central role in us understanding what exactly are the issues around COVID-19 and what needs to happen next. Well, they're both with me right now. One of them, Professor Salim Abdool Karim and Professor Quarraisha Abdool Karim. Salim may interject and say, I'm not Salim, I'm Slim. We'll argue with that as well. But to both of you, great to have you with us, and thanks for joining us on this feature we call The Champion People. So thumbs up to both of you.
Very much, Asha.
Okay, so Salim, I'm going to ask you this here. Let's get this part right. In terms of a few months ago, both of you, I understand, are part of the Presidential Advisory Council, the committee to the president. But a few months ago, suddenly you were asked to present to a national audience, and for many of us, it appeared that life had changed. Suddenly, like, who is this guy? So let's start with that. Tell me how did you feel going into that interview or presentation? How did you feel after that?
So I have spent most of my life in academia and in presenting to large audiences. We regularly present at big international conferences. When we presented, when Quarraisha presented the results of our research that showed that antiretrovirals prevent HIV in women, we did so to an audience of over 10,000 people. So we have done, but we've never done something that goes on television in this kind of way. Our task as advisors is to do the backroom work. We are simply the people who crunch the numbers, and we look at what the data are showing, and we know what the data are. And it's up to them to decide what to do with that. So it's a very unusual thing to then get asked to come out of the back room and put a spotlight on us in this particular event. And I think for me, the key thing about it was that it was an opportunity to share with the entire country exactly what's going on in this epidemic. It was epidemiology 101 of explaining where the virus is, how it spreads, what can we expect. And I think, as lecturers, as teachers at universities, that ensures that the people listening to you understand what you're trying to say.
So
fudge it, you clarify it.
So when you were asked, who asked you to present?
So it was the Minister of Health who informed me that the President had wanted us to share some of the evidence that we have shared with him and others. Take the nation into confidence and share with them what the data are. And that's what we did.
And your immediate response was what? When you were asked at that time, what did you think? What did you say?
I said, we can do this in half an hour. I could just present it, and it shouldn't take too long. I think if we used about an hour, we can get it done. And so I was a bit shocked that it took 2 hours, partly because of the challenges in technology, partly because there were so many questions that people had that they felt, we should rather extend the time and answer the questions. So it did take me aback that it would take so long, and I was ready to do this. Quarraisha was there as well. We were both there, and we were just trying to convey the information as best we could.
So now both of you are professors, Professor Salim Abdool Karim and Professor Quarraisha Abdool Karim. Salim, you've made a point, you call yourself Slim. Quarraisha, can I call you Quarraisha?
Well, you can call me Quarraisha, you can call me Professor Abdool Karim, you can even call me
Oh my goodness, that would be fun.
For HIV. You can also call me Q, as I'm sometimes fondly referred to.
Okay, so, well, Q sounds like one of those James Bond, coded names, Project Q,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
You hit it on the head.
Have both of you had this experience, I'm sure you've had, where somebody contacts you to speak to Professor Karim, and they don't quite know which Karims they've invited until finding out later on? Quarraisha, your thoughts first?
And I think when asked which Professor Abdool Karim, the person on the other end is usually very perplexed. But I can tell you that besides the humor of it at the moment, it's created, we both travel a lot because of the work we do. And sometimes I'm supposed to be met in a foreign country, at the airport, or somewhere that I'm not familiar with. And they insist the driver is at the airport, and it turns out the driver is looking for a male. So sometimes that can be quite awkward and actually scary, depending on where I am. But most of the time, I think most people get it right as to which one they...
I'm sure you have lots of great stories around that. Let's get back to that night, because I want to focus on that. And you've already said, Slim, that presenting to academic audiences is what you do all the time. But when the invitation came from the Minister of Health, you knew, and both of you would have known, that you're going to speak to what? 3 million, 4 million, 5 million people around the country, and that could well change a lot of things, right? How did you feel, therefore, going into that from a mental preparation point of view?
I know the epidemiology was pretty straightforward, so it wasn't going to be complicated. I think for me, what was an issue was that I am very used to an academic presentation where you let the slides speak for themselves and you just highlight the key issues in the slides. So about 20 minutes into my presentation, I get a nudge. They can't see your slides. I said, oh my goodness, what have I been doing here? I've been talking about my slides and nobody can see them because the television wasn't ready for that. They didn't know how to do this. Now, when we go to conferences, they know exactly how to do this. They have the slides are projected into the system and they appear in the screen. And then they have the person doing the presentation as a little box. It's a picture-in-picture. So you can see the person presenting, but the person is small. The picture is taken up by the slide. So I had just assumed that's what was happening here, that everyone could see, everything I was talking about in the slides. 20 minutes into the talk, they tell me, no, nobody saw the slide. I said, well, how would you even understand what I'm saying if you don't see the slides? So we have to start again.
Did you start again?
Yes. The cameraman was asked actually there were 3 or 4 of them, they were all asked to shift their cameras to focus on the screen behind me that had the slides, because they don't have a system where the slides feed into their camera, into their system. So they had to actually take it through their cameras off me, which made no sense why they were showing me. They needed to show the slides. So they sorted the problem out about 20 minutes into my talk. So I went slide 3 or something and started the talk again. But I gave a short version of it, not repeating everything, and allowing people to see each slide now. And then by the time we got to like slide 8, I had caught up with where I was previously.
Now, I've obviously been aware of the success that both of you had in your careers, and they've been stellar careers up to now. So I knew who you guys were. We're not best friends, but I certainly knew who you were, right? And I've watched you people in action, being in the media space that I'm on. And I remember about 2 weeks before, Prof Salim, that you had this big face the media thing. You did an interview on ENCA as well, and you were brilliant. And I remember telling my wife and children even then, it's like, you have got to see how articulate this professor is, right? Of course, they didn't take me seriously. So when it came to that night, that special important night, I was not in the least surprised at how convincing you came across, because it's what I expected, right? But were you surprised at the public response to you immediately afterwards? The overwhelming positivity, if not the scientific part, certainly in terms of the clarity of thought that you displayed in come through. Were you surprised at that?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can. Go ahead, yeah. Were you surprised at that? Yeah.
Yeah. I have to say, I had no idea what to expect. And, we did the presentation, Quarraisha and I then had a few things to do at the command center. We left and came home, and just oblivious to everything. We just did another presentation. It was no big deal. But when we came home, our kids, both our daughters, to us and said, "Do you know you're trending?" No, I'm wearing my usual clothes. And they said, no, it's on the social media you're trending. It's not about trendy clothes. So they explained to me what that is. And they said, okay, this is what it is. I said, well, that's very nice that people thought it was helpful. I think, in these times of uncertainty, it's always important to get the information, or to get it in a way that's not value laden. You don't try to push people thinking in a direction. Facts are, and let them make up their own minds. And you present what you think they are, but you ensure that you empower people in the process. And I think I didn't have a sense of how important this process was for the public. I had no clue. And it came as a surprise. And as it sort of sunk in, it became clearer to me that some things that we just take for granted, because we are epidemiologists, we know how viruses spread, we know what to do. We spent 40 years of our lives working in research and in these areas, looking at viruses. So to us, it just comes here. But we hadn't factored that actually not everybody was in that privileged position. And now this was an opportunity And so by the next day, everyone's an epidemiologist, staff, using epidemiological terms to understand the epidemic. And yeah, so that for me was a very empowering process.
Okay, so
people
let me ask you this. So you were there at the presentation, but you were not very visible face-wise because your back was turned to all of us, right? Away from us. But when you found out from your daughters as well that dad's trending, your husband's trending across the country, what were you thinking?
You know, Slim is so popular. So seriously, 3 years. We've been concerned about the growing anti-science sentiment in the public. And it takes many shapes and forms. And, you know, as HIV/AIDS researchers, we spend a lot of our time in communities and advocacy groups trying to demystify what we're doing and also putting community perspectives into the knowledge generation process. So it's something we've done. But 3 years ago, we decided to be part of the March for Science Day and have been having these marches through the city of Durban, and we did two. This year we had to pause it because of the COVID-19 epidemic. And it has been really impressive to see how public interest grows, because a lot of what we need to do, rational, evidence-based decision-making, whatever field you're in, needs to be the way we move forward and not be distracted by fake news and so on. So as I was sitting in the command center and going through the questions that were coming in and trying to arrange it in some way so that I went into the discussion, the thing that struck me most was, wow, this is the most powerful intervention we've ever done in terms of popularizing science for the reasons I just outlined. And it was, so when I walked in and the girls were saying that this was on social media and so on, I felt what type of communication we've been trying to do in HIV, and in one fell swoop, something that we had never thought of, doing this on national TV, achieved what we've been trying to do for many years. So very excited that that worked, and we have a new tool to communicate with the public complex scientific ideas that affect.
Well, it certainly did so. So much to consider. One of the things when I was watching, and I probably was one of the people that contributed to yourself, Slim, trending, because I certainly was very complimentary about your presentation. It said so. One of the tweets I picked up from someone very early on that evening, when people was like, wow, right, look at this prof, right? Someone said, and you know what's the good thing about it? He's not the brightest guy in the family. And then somebody else said, but who is that? And the person said, oh, it's his wife. So it's quite funny. Yeah.
No, let me put that straight. I think we both have our own together. We've been able to develop a lot of synergy, and I believe we've been able to accomplish a lot more than if we were both on our own paths wherever we were.
Well,
I have to differ.
Okay. So who's
we don't differ.
Who's the brightest in the family?
I have to differ.
Slim? Between the two of you? Who then is the brightest in the family?
There is no question in my mind that when I refer half, I mean it both figuratively and literally. And there's no doubt in my mind that we have two halves in the Abdool Karims, and the better half is to my right.
Well, there you are. And then very quickly,
I
I was thinking about it at night to say, you know, the problem with Professor Karim is, and Mrs. Professor Karim, they're not on Twitter, and they don't understand the power of it. And then I started watching suddenly your daughters emerge as if from the cobwebs. This is all on that same night. And they're like, that's our parents. And then you realize that, in fact, besides the two of you, you have two formidable daughters in a similar space to yourself. And then we find out later on, you have a son who's also achieved. And I remember someone saying, my goodness, this is South African royalty. So interesting, Quarraisha, or Q, that you said earlier on. We can call you Her Majesty. This is a better royalty than the other royalty.
Yeah, we're very fortunate that we have three wonderful children, and I'm glad because people often talk about, of course, I have their own careers well established in health journalism and health law, and our son, who's the youngest, is in his final year at UT in computer science. But the thing that not many people understand, in January already, as part of work experience, he was trying to understand this new virus that was just isolated from Wuhan province, to look at how similar it was to the original SARS virus, etc. So he is the only one actually published in the peer-reviewed literature on the topic of COVID-19. The rest of us are trying to understand data, trying to understand legal implications of public health and trying to communicate it. But he's the published one in the past.
Well, that's an incredible, list of achievements as a family, right? It does get me ask both of you this question, like, can you pin it down to one specific reason why this family, why your family have been so incredibly successful already? That's the five of you now. A reason?
I think some of it is related to the value we placed on being curious. That when children were young, we encouraged them to ask questions, to go and try and find the answers themselves and not just feed them with things. We highlighted the importance of having an inquiring mind, and then we left it to them. So we didn't try to make them clones of us. We just tried to make them people who wanted to understand the world and wanted to contribute to it. And I think Quarraisha will highlight that we instilled in them not just, a curiosity and a love for understanding the world, but we also instilled in them the values of ensuring that we contribute to the world. Mm-hmm. And we have spent our lives doing that. Quarraisha can elaborate on that.
Well, please do. Quarraisha.
Well, I would add much more, which is, there are two things. The one is that the curiosity, I'm not sure how you nurture. You're kind of born with it. And I think Slim and I, independently in our home environments and in school, had that really supported. And the second part, I think, that maybe is where there's a bit of additional pieces that we put in on being scientists, is growing up during apartheid South Africa and being activists is the social justice component. And I think as epidemiologists, not accidental that we epidemiologists, because epidemiology actually is, I think, the only scientific discipline that merges the rigor of science with social justice. And that's how we live our life. It's not just work. It's our entire life is about how do we do and leave the world better. And science enables us to move forward. The social justice enables us to focus where we make that difference.
And what's the one-line definition, layperson's definition, Quarraisha, of what you do, epidemiology?
I think service to people.
Yeah, I think in medicine, everything we do in medicine is about service to people. It's about social justice. Epidemiology is one of the many disciplines that contributes in a structured way to making the world a better place. And as epidemiologists, we use that knowledge as best we can to try and highlight what shall I say, injustices or inequities, but we also are about using that to better understand why those come about and how can we fix it. So it's about understanding the world, but also understanding how to make it better. And that's what Quarraisha is referring to, that as a discipline, it is one of many that helps us understand the world and improve it.
Do you have a story as to how both of you came to follow that path of epidemiology? Is it many people will often say, well, it happened quite by chance. I have a feeling there was no chance when it came to both of you. Quarraisha, you go first.
So actually, Slim introduced the concept of epidemiology. So I'm a biochemist by training, and I had two lives, which is my day job, studying hematological disorders. And in the evening and in the weekends, I would work with the Progressive Primary Healthcare Network then, and other groups trying to understand health disparities and also take services to communities that didn't have access to healthcare. And I always saw these as two different parts of my life. And I had heard Slim and I happened to be at the medical school at the Nelson R. Mandela School of Medicine, and I had heard that he had the scholarship to go study epidemiology in the US. And that was the first time I actually heard about it, read a little bit, and then in chatting to him, we were friends at that stage. I was just like completely blown away. And then I started wondering, why is this not taught in South Africa? And the sort of backdrop to why it was not a scientific discipline in South Africa became more apparent. And that's when I had the opportunity to study at Columbia University, there was no going back in terms of me as a scientist and what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do that.
Okay, how did you guys meet? Meaning, you've already mentioned you're on the same campus. I understand that, but how did you meet as in what? Soon to be lovers and husband and wife one day. What happened there? Slim, you go.
So I was in the Department of Virology. I was studying viruses as a registrar, specializing in viruses. And in our department, we were the only place in the medical school that had a particular piece of equipment called an ultracentrifuge. And Quarraisha, who was doing research in a completely different department in hematology, needed to use this piece of equipment. And so she would come to the department, to my department in virology, to use our ultracentrifuge. So that's how I first got to meet her, and that's how we got to first chatting.
Quarraisha, you have a similar story or a different one?
I told you the same thing. Well, him telling you the ultracentrifuge first is a reflection. You know, if I needed to do an experiment, those days equipment was expensive, not everybody had it, and I'd go around the medical school to find that department that had that equipment and negotiate it. And in terms of that ultracentrifuge, every time I went to use it, I had to pass Slim's desk, which was at the entrance before you entered the lab. So every now and again, while my stuff was spinning in the centrifuge, if he happened to be there and looked like he wasn't busy, I'd ask him things like, how do you study epidemiology? And we learned that we had a lot of things in common, mainly values, shared values.
Well, you have so much more in common now. At what point then, Quarraisha, did it translate into, I like this guy. I think he's the guy for me. Or is there a different story to that?
really, because I told you, I met him a few weeks before he was leaving to go on the scholarship to the US. So, I like him, but who knows what happens from there.
What happened then finally, Islam? How did it translate into what you were studying and colleagues on campus, to being abroad, to actually getting married?
Yeah, I think in the nature of academia, it was very convenient that I was the gatekeeper to an important piece of equipment that she needed. So I could control her access to a key part of what she needed for her experiments. So that gave me some power in an otherwise powerless situation as the gatekeeper to the machine. Yeah.
What was that key part?
Sorry, what you were asking
that
me?
key part that Quarraisha needed, that gave you the power, what was it?
Oh, he's exaggerating the power he had.
Oh my goodness! Now, I mean,
it was just, it was a piece of equipment.
Okay, got that. Let's. I want to talk about Caprisa in a moment, but let's just stay with COVID-19 in terms of where we are now. Salim, how did you get invited? Because both of you are on this Presidential Advisory Council. How did you get invited, and then how did you end up becoming the chairperson? What did you feel about it?
Yeah, so it's the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID-19. So we don't actually advise the president, we advise the minister. The minister then advises the president. Occasionally the president will ask for advice, but it's essentially we advise the Department of Health and the minister. My assistant came into my office one Monday to say that the minister's office called and they wanted my contact details. And I said, well, he has it, but if they need it, it's fine. They can, you can share it with them. And so we provided the information, and about a week or maybe a few days later, I received an email saying you are invited to this meeting with the Minister of Health to discuss the COVID-19 epidemic. And I didn't make much of it. I said, yeah, sure, happy to join the meeting. So I wrote back straight away saying, sure, I'll attend. And I didn't know at the time that Quarraisha had also received
okay.
invitation. And because I didn't make much of it, I didn't even mention it. And so when we joined the call, I think it was a Monday or a Tuesday the following week, I think it was a Tuesday, I saw Quarraisha was also on the call. And many people who, of course, I know from the HIV field were also on the call.
So let me understand this. I want to get this right. So both of you got invited, and the fact that you're married is just a coincidence, but none of you mentioned that, like, tomorrow I'm going to be part of a Department of Health national think tank with the minister because of COVID-19. It was, just another day in the life of both of you that you didn't bother telling each other? Salim?
Well, I think we didn't know what it was. We thought we were just being invited to a meeting. It didn't seem like anything particularly that we should really discuss. It was, we're invited to a meeting. We get invited to meetings all the time. And often we get invited, both of us get invited to the same meeting, independently of each other. And most of the time we'll sort of let each other know, but on something that we didn't even know what this was about, what was I going to tell her? I'm on a call with the minister, or I don't even know what this is about. So I said, let me go and see what the situation is, and she's also on the same call. Yeah.
So,
All right.
So it sounds a little bit like arrogant, but it's not. What it really is that we both have a lot of meetings and a lot of things going on. We do things together. We don't share every detail of our lives. There just isn't time to do that. But one of the things is when the kids were younger, we were very careful about travel and meetings because we had a rule in the house that one of us always needed to be at home. Now that none of the kids actually are at home, they all grown up and in other parts of the country, we a little bit slacker about, oh, I have this, because we don't have to do the parenting timetabling that we used to do. But it is, we take part in many discussions locally and globally, and it's part of our job that we both scientists, but we also global citizens, and we give back as needed at an advisory level, because, I mean, we both believe that our science just doesn't end when we answer a research question. The type of questions we ask, we like to influence policy and, more importantly, ensure it gets to benefit people who need to benefit from the outcomes of that research. So we welcome these opportunities and when it presents, we're there as that's what we need to do.
Of course. Now, Quarraisha is something I'll touch on, and on the work around HIV/AIDS. But you've mentioned earlier, Quarraisha, that science is not a sexy topic. People, it's like, don't bore me with that sort of thing. Besides scientists, right? And that particular television appearance and subsequent appearances has helped Prof Salim Abdool Karim and therefore Quarraisha put the brand your organization and what you really do, which is HIV. But it started not just from TV, it started from the invitation then, not just to attend, but Salim, from your side, then to become the chairperson of that advisory committee. How did you feel about that? I mean, did it come from the minister to say, I want you to head it up?
So when I was invited to the call and attended the call, it was a very interesting meeting because the minister went through a whole range of issues about the clinical challenges of managing COVID and so on. And in the course of the meeting, the acting director general outlined that there would be 3 committees in this new structure: one for clinicians, one for laboratory matters, and one for public health matters. And that these 3 committees everybody on the call must decide which committee they want to belong to. They must elect a chairperson to be in charge of each of the committees. And at that point, the Director General announced that I will be the overarching chairperson. And I didn't know that. He didn't ask me beforehand. Not that it mattered, because, of course, I would do it anyway. But I learned about it at the same time as everyone else learned about it. And I sort of was a bit not clear about what that meant, but I sort of figured, it's what we make of this, and how we can take this responsibility and fulfill a duty. And that's more or less the basis on which we sort of took this on. I mean, after the meeting, we talked about it and what this committee is about and how it could play a role and so on. And we really saw it as, how can we help? It was as simple as that. How can we help? This is a big problem. It needs all hands on deck. And is there something we can do that would help in the government's and the nation's response? And that meant that we had to collect evidence. That became our job. Our job was, there was a question, The minister asked a question. We then collected the evidence and we said, based on what we know and what the science is, given that everything is so fluid in the field of COVID-19, this is what we can recommend. And often our recommendation is really, this is the least bad of the bad options you have. And based on what we've seen with other viruses, or based on what we've seen from the data in China on COVID, this is what is probably going to be the best of the ways in which this is done. I just have to step away because that's the minister's office. I'll leave Quarraisha to carry on.
Okay, that's fine. So and I want to know. I thought, I mean, can't we go live and see what the minister has to tell Professor Karim? This is real. This happens right now. Quarraisha, let's talk about expectations, and I'll put this to Slim just now when he gets back.
Yes.
The expectations in terms of the advice that both of you and the rest of your committee have given to the minister around COVID-19. Key on that is the issue of lockdown, which many people have embraced, but there's also a sense of like this lockdown's costing us money economically, right? So in many ways, the scientists and the minister and the president are praised, but at other times, there's almost like a side cynicism about like, these guys are costing us our jobs. We don't need a lockdown. What's your thoughts to that sort of communication?
So firstly, just a reminder, we advise. And we advise based on understanding the epidemic itself. How is the virus spreading and how is it changing as the epidemic evolves? So we don't make decisions about lockdown. Levels of lockdown, lifting of lockdown, that's above our pay grade in the matter. But what we've been able to do, and as you recall from the Easter Monday presentation, show how this is a very new virus, like all of 120 days in the world, and even fewer in South Africa. South Africa started to see a late introduction, and that was mainly initially from travelers. Then it was the contacts of the travelers and healthcare workers, and now it's spreading in the community. So our advice is, how do we track this virus? How do we expand the way we monitor this virus, and what is happening, and what are the kinds of interventions that we have available in the absence of a vaccine or cure, but the available tools that we have that we can bring to bear in terms of responding as the epidemic is moving along. And the idea is never, and the advice, to stop the spread of the virus, but really, because none of us have immunity and there is no vaccine, so it's inevitable that we will be exposed to the virus, we'll get infected, some of us mildly, some of us asymptomatic, and some people with severe clinical disease. The one worry that we did have is that there's a number of comorbidities that are associated, so other conditions, cardiovascular, respiratory, immunosuppressive, and particularly the issue of HIV and TB, which, although we have a younger population, that's really, we are home to about 1 in 5 infections globally. So that's the connection between the HIV work and the COVID-19. So very early on, as individuals and as the MAC, we were concerned about what is the interaction likely to be and the need not to lose on our response to the HIV, TB epidemics while we simultaneously respond to COVID-19. So just saying, COVID-19 is happening in the middle of a whole lot of things, and suddenly, like, what should we do? How do we, when flights are stopped, and then you start flying again, what should you be doing? And so sharing this knowledge that we had around what is available, and that you don't go with a sledgehammer when you have an ant, but also you can anticipate from the knowledge we're garnering happening around the world. How do we bring that to bear so that our approaches can be rational and evidence-based? And I can't say that we've succeeded every time in terms of rational decision-making, but, we advise.
And the fact that you advise, they don't always listen to you, do they? How do you feel about that? When you know you're right, but you're not listened to?
Well, I'm not sure that not every, so there's different levels of decision making. I can tell you quite categorically that we advise the Minister of Health. And I think the Minister of Health really listens to the advice that's provided and acts on that advice. And we've seen that in the way we appreciating the differentiated rate of transmission in the country and the responses, the preparedness. So I would tick the boxes on most of the advice that we have provided has actually been acted upon by the minister that we are advising. What happens beyond the Ministry of Health is not within our control.
Now,
and I think, we're all trying to learn and act while the ship is sailing. I mean, it's not like HIV that we had 10, 20 years to think and ponder, and there's 5 to 7 years. This virus spreads in a matter of hours and days. And that level of nimbleness and responsiveness is amazing in the country in terms of leadership. But there have been wobbles. There have been wobbles even within the committee. So I think we're all trying to learn, and we don't know all the answers. But when we find we're going in the wrong direction, we need to come back and build on the knowledge that we have. So firstly, I don't think we're all perfect as advisors. And two, that acting and implementing with rapidity is not always possible because it's a complex set of dynamics out there that needs to be taken into account. But I think the one thing that I appreciate in this epidemic, and I'm sure shared by others, is that it's not just what government does, it's what we do as individuals. And the more knowledge we have as individuals and the more we utilize that knowledge, the more as a collective and as a country we can benefit in terms of flattening that curve, of slowing down the spread of the virus and not overwhelming our health facilities with too many ill patients coming. People are going to get ill and people are going to get infected. We can't stop those two things because we don't have those tools right now. But what we have to do is pay attention to the evidence. And I think that the Minister of Health has been very, very mindful about sharing that evidence most days. On TV, he's there and he shares, even if he doesn't understand what underlies it. And I think that's very important and a very important precedent that he set with COVID-19 in terms of transparency and openness in terms of sharing information. If he's not sharing it, he doesn't know it. He's trying to understand it, and when he understands it, so that's the other thing I've appreciated working with the Minister of Health, is he's a very considered person. So he's not rushing to say something unless he understands it. And I think, you can't every day say something new, but sometimes you have to monitor things for a few days before you can make sense of it and say, this is now a consistent body of knowledge, and this is how we need to intervene.
Now, and I have to sort of date this because things will change. It's a moving target. As we talk, yesterday there were like 700 and some odd infections in the day. The last whole week has been like 600 odd. Many people may watch us even in a year's time, right? So the answers, they would speak in the past tense. But currently, South Africa, about 12,000 infections, 200 odd people dying. And then you get the sense from others to say, we've supported the lockdown early, 3 weeks, then 2 weeks, but now, no, this is crazy. More people will die from poverty and lose jobs than ever be seriously affected, if not infected, by COVID-19. How do you, not just as a scientist, but as a social scientist aware of societal issues, how do you reconcile those two?
Yeah, so I can talk about as an advisor and as a scientist about the virology and the epidemiology, but I'm also an individual living within society. And so anything I say in relation to other things is really from my personal perspective. It's not, this is the evidence we have. And so I don't understand economics enough to be an expert on the economics. But what I do understand is rights. And I think sometimes, in many instances, in several instances, we've seen the worst violations of human rights taking place. And to me, that's like unacceptable. So we do have constitutional protection, but in a disaster situation, in an emergency situation, we have to be mindful, particularly with a public health disaster, that we're not compromising human rights. And so what is that balance that needs to be struck? And as citizens, we need to be very vigilant around the human rights violations and speak out against it. And that's where I think once you go beyond health, we're dealing with very different departments and have very little input. But that's where active citizenship comes in. And I think we have spoken out against human rights violations before, and it's time to do that. So we're not passive in this. In responding to the epidemic, government is playing a leadership role, but we all players in this, and it's our combined and collective efforts. And so as we go along and as we advance, we've made many gains in terms of slowing down the spread of COVID-19 and also preparedness. But we need to be mindful, I think, as we go forward, that we keep our eye on the ball, which is the fight is against the virus, not against each other. And that we can voice our dissent, but our dissent should not be a distraction from what our goal is.
Now, as we talking about active citizenry, Professor Salim Abdool Karim's chair remains empty because he's taken the call from the Minister of Health. How often do they talk to each other in a day?
Oh, the minister talks to the committee regularly, and also to the chair and the subcommittee. So Slim mentioned there are subcommittees within the committee. So that's what I was referring to by saying that the minister is in touch with the leadership on a regular basis and constantly being fed news in terms of what we're learning, what we understand, what works, what doesn't work, in terms of the epidemic itself, from a public health perspective, from a clinical perspective, from a laboratory perspective. And that's why I'm confident about his knowledge, because he takes the time to be briefed and understand what is new, while simultaneously doing his other duties at a country level. So he's sitting and waiting. He's there in the communities, learning firsthand what's going on.
Okay, and as I talk, Slim is back.
Exactly.
So, tell us about that phone call.
The minister is in the Eastern Cape because we've seen a surge of cases in the Eastern Cape. So they were just checking with me about some of the data for the Eastern Cape. So it's a technical matter.
All right. Just I've asked Quarraisha about this, but I want to just put this to you very quickly then. There's huge expectations from the public that the president's got his story right, that the Minister of Health has got his story right, that the chairperson of the advisory committee to the Minister of Health, Professor Abdool Karim, and his committee, including Quarraisha, they've all got their story right. What's your biggest fears? What's your biggest hopes around COVID-19, Slim?
I think one of the things that we've been trying to convey is what is our goal? What are we trying to do here? And that essentially is a concept that is called flattening the curve. And what that simply means is that we're trying to reduce the number of infections so that when the peak, when that surge of cases comes, which I've said is inevitable, that surge and that peak will be a much lower peak than we would have seen otherwise. And we've seen that when that peak is high, as was the case in Italy, as was the case in New York, the healthcare service is completely overwhelmed. And so patients are dying in the street trying to get into a hospital, but there's no beds, there's no space, there's just too many people needing care all at the same time. And when that happens, the death rate goes up. So we want to manage this in a way that when people get sick, we have adequate healthcare services so that people can have the option and have the benefit of good medical care, and so we keep the number of deaths low. So essentially, it's about saving lives. Saving lives by ensuring that the number of cases is not so much that we can't cope. And so we do that in two ways. We try to keep the number of infections lower, and we try to increase the number of beds and ventilators and ICU beds that we have. So it's a combination of things that we do. And as we balance this requirement, one of my great fears is that it will still overwhelm us, that we will reach a point when the virus is just spreading so fast that it becomes futile in terms of what we're trying to do. And that surge, when it comes, my fear is that it would overwhelm us. I think we've done really a lot to avoid that picture, to avoid that scenario where we are seeing so many deaths. But in the world of science, there's no certainty. Everything is about a level of uncertainty. And so I worry about that scenario, which I think is probably not going to happen. But if it does happen, that we would have done a disservice to our nation in terms of our commitment to try and see how can we flatten the curve and keep the cases within the manageability of the health services.
Well, I think your concerns are worrisome. They sobering in terms of people who are like rushing to get back to work, but understandable from a scientific point that you would err on the side of conservative. I hope you're right, that we'd be able to manage things. It's a good time to ask, both of you. So we know you're a scientist. Salim, do you have a spiritual core that guides, that inspires you outside of the socio-political aspect of serving humanity?
I think each one of us has a spiritual inner core that we define for ourselves, and we have in each of us a little voice that tells us and guides us about what our calling should be. And we listen to it, or we choose not to listen to it. It's entirely up to us. But it's really about how we see our role in society. And that's how, I have seen the way in which I would like to be a human being, is how have I contributed to society. I have no interest in money. I have no interest in political position. I have no interest in anything else because those have no meaning for me. The thing that I have meaning, that gives me meaning in life, my fulfillment, comes from looking at how we can make the world a better place.
And Q?
Mine is not too different. I mean, I think I woke up and maybe my first thought, because I started school very early in life, like 3 years ago, has always been a fascination with the miracles that surround us, and just marvel every time we discover something new and learn some. I mean, it's been there. We're just discovering what's already there. And to be able to contribute to leaving the world a better place, I feel like, wow, we've inherited so much, and we have to leave a legacy that's better than what we've inherited. And if through the work I do, I can make a small difference, that's what I try to do every day when I wake up in the morning and I go to bed thinking, what is it that I'm going to do better tomorrow? And so we've had the privilege of many opportunities, several opportunities. And I think that's a privilege that we appreciate and we invest our time in.
You started school at the age of 3. Oh my goodness. Slim, there's a story why you called Slim. I mean, for obvious reasons, it'd be like the shortened version of Salim. But is there a cleverer reason than that? A better answer?
It all happened when I was in high school. I was not particularly fond of my Afrikaans lessons. My Afrikaans teacher was a lovely person, but I just didn't like the subject. So I would often be difficult to us. And one day she came up to me and said, "Jy dink jy is slim." Meaning, you think you're too clever. And you could imagine, in the next break in the class, in the school timetable, everybody came to me. "You didn't get slim. You didn't get slim." So it just stuck. It helped that I was somewhat rotund. It helped that my name was Salim, and if you just drop the A, so it just stuck. It struck a chord with people, and everybody started calling me Slim, and I embraced the nickname, and up to this day, most people call me Slim.
Okay, because interesting, on that night, that Easter Monday, when everybody was talking about your presentation, I remember a person tweeting and say, "And guess what? That's why we call him Slim." And that's come from Professor Jonathan Jansen, who then tweeted that point and made many other people aware that actually he's called Slim, which is fascinating. But so the name is stuck. Do I take it that both of you, because Quarraisha, you've mentioned you started at 3 years old, that both of you were pretty slim, really, at school from day one? You were sharp.
Yeah.
I think pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, I was, among the top students in school throughout, and I went straight from high school. So, yeah.
You were slim. Yeah. Right. Quarraisha?
Yeah, we did well in school.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I loved going to school. I loved learning, and for as long as I can remember. So, it's not surprising. And as I said, I grew up in Tonga. I went to a state-aided school, no fancy private schools or anything. We don't come from wealthy backgrounds. But we had amazing teachers who were able to support and nurture and encourage that curiosity, and just allowed us to thrive and not be threatened. And I think those are all very important parts of who we are and shaping who we are.
And I think about
as
Quarraisha was talking.
Well, maybe I'm going to ask both of you this. In fact, 3 names of individuals that you you absolutely admire, you look up to? And I don't mean your children, I mean others that you looked up in your life. Slim, you go first.
When I look back, three people influenced my life enormously by being my mentor. When I was in school, it was my physics teacher, Mr. Kasim Sidat. Then when I went to medical school, my mentor was Professor Jerry Kuvadia, who then supervised my PhD. And I did most of my early research with Jerry Kuvadia. And then when we went to New York, I were mentored by a South African couple who were the two professors of epidemiology in the Department of Epidemiology.
Wow.
And Mervyn Sasser was my mentor, and his wife, Zina Stein, was Quarraisha's mentor. And Zina Stein is still alive. She's 96 years old and still writing for journals. These three individuals have had an enormous influence. They have shaped who we are and what we have been able to do.
Correct.
And now we work with, we have several role models, people who we look up to, who are giants in the world of science and who have really shown us how science can play a role for the betterment of society. And Peter Piot comes to mind, Anthony Fauci comes to mind, as people, we hold in high regard, and people who serve as beacons for how science can really make a difference.
Are they like your chummies as well? You hang out with them when you get a chance?
We go to visit the NIH at least once a year, and we will use that opportunity to catch up with our colleagues at the NIH, including Dr. Fauci, Dr. Francis Collins, and so on. And with Peter Piot, we are in touch with him on a much more frequent basis. We often, are in the same meetings and so on, and we were deeply concerned when he became infected with the coronavirus. And he wrote a very interesting article about his experience with this virus. It's published in Science, and it really captured, he's such a wonderful human being. And to hear his whole experience was quite moving.
Okay.
Yeah,
we need to get it.
you said he's given a long list, but I'm going to confirm Jerry Kovadia, Mervyn Sasser, Zina Stein, and not elaborate it. But the one point I wanted to make is that I think in our relationships with our mentors, with our collaborators, we try to develop very personal relationships with them. So it's not unusual that we'd be having people over for dinner, and the collegiality and extends in terms of how we live and what we do and who influences us.
Okay, just answer that last bit. We lost your sound, so you mentioned the names, and then continue in terms of why they're important to you, Quarraisha.
Oh, so these are not just mentors to us. So when we think about Zina, who's almost 97 years old, we've had a relationship that spans over 3 decades. And she's such an inspiration that at 97 almost, she still continues to make scientific contributions. She's getting frailer. But it's an example that it's not just a mentor, but it's part of our family, part of our relationships, part of our social interactions. That we do anything for them, and I'm sure they do anything for us. So that's the nature of the relationships that we have with these individuals, that it's not just people we look up to, but people we care a lot about too.
Now, this feature that you're talking to me on is called Champion People, and it's part of a project that I head up called Champion South Africa, and our key phrase or motto is Champion People, Build Champion Nations. I'd love to pick both of your brains about just internalizing what that means to you, if anything. Champion people, build champion nations. Salim, you go first.
First, I think that we have seen throughout history that individuals can make a difference. But they make a difference not just because they are self-driven, but because they understand how they fit into a society and that they exist as individuals because of others. And it's described very well in the idiom of Ubuntu. But we are only who we are because of everyone around us. Nobody is in some kind of cocoon being able to do this. We exist by virtue of everybody else. And so our contributions, the way in which we do this, is very much part and parcel of our society. So I'm a strong supporter of the notion that, each one of us needs to be part and parcel of being champions if we are to make our entire country a champion.
Well,
it's not going to happen, just by a handful. It's how each one of us helps everyone else is that little champion in them, and how all of that combined will make us a great nation.
Well, you sound like an ambassador for the Champion South Africa movement just by giving that sort of reply. Quarraisha, your thoughts? Champion people, build champion nations?
So firstly, thank you for the honor to include us in this really commendable program. And I think that, we're really privileged to be recognized this way and our work profiled and appreciated, because we don't do it for the recognition, but that we can be role models for the betterment of humanity, whether that's South Africa or beyond, I think is what we all should aspire to, whatever it is that we're doing. Because I think that in giving off our best and supporting others to give off their best, we've already demonstrated what a remarkable nation we can be. And sometimes I think we lose our gaze on what we can achieve with solidarity and keeping our eye on the ball. And here we have another opportunity with COVID-19 to bring that working together for a common good. And that's, I think, we've seen repeatedly makes a huge difference.
And
so less about you, more about togetherness. And working to the same goal.
So our goal as Champion South Africa is to move South Africa from a mid-table nation to a champion nation, right? Now, what's the biggest impediment that prevents us from becoming a champion nation, Quarraisha?
So I think sometimes we get caught in the weeds. We get distracted. And we forget that we shape our own destiny and we can be the architects of our own destiny. So sometimes one of the weeds that trip us is we get a sense of entitlement and we're waiting for things to happen. Something is going to happen. And I think we have to say that we are privileged just to be here using all this oxygen. Let's use it in a very productive way. And let's define what it is. And it's going to be different for different people. But if we strive for excellence, if we less about who's owing me what, then I think we can achieve a lot. And there are lots of examples of how we've really excelled in many different fields. And And that again is brilliant profiling you doing and others in terms of what we can achieve as a nation when we strive for excellence and we strive for leaving the place better than when we found it.
Absolutely. Professor Salim Abdool Karim, your thoughts on how we can become this champion nation?
Well, I think Chris has put it well, that the strength of humanity is its diversity, and that within that diversity, while you have those who have a particular approach in life where they are looking for the betterment of everyone, you also have those who are interested in their own glory, in their own minute in the sun, in their own wealth. And so they are the ones that end up robbing our nation of its opportunity to become great, either because they loot when there's an opportunity, or they sow division when there's an opportunity, or they take us away from our united stand for a common goal. Building a common purpose is essential for a successful nation, and we lose that. And it's very important that we have this amazing freedom in our country to be who we want to be, to say what we wish to say. And we deeply respect everyone's rights to do that. And that is also part of our strength. And how we balance those rights and responsibilities become how we can move forward as a nation.
And we often talk about, well, I presented the other day, we spoke about South Africa lacking a USP, a unique selling point, right? What do you think, Salim, is what would be that selling point? Do we have one, a USP?
I think we did when we stood together in 1994. I think we did, and we captured it in a very visible and in a way that sort of conjured up the image. And we used the phrase, the Rainbow Nation. And that Rainbow Nation captivated us. That from a nation that had been completely sundered, that we were coming together, and that we individually had our own color, but together we produced something brilliant. And I think that Rainbow Nation concept was really powerful as a binding force. But it very quickly dissipated. And that hasn't been replaced with a new vision that can re-enamor us, rebuild our faith, and re-galvanize us. And I think efforts are being made to do that. And I'm only hopeful that we will find that opportunity, because it's not something that, it's something that all of us together come up, buy into, and support. And if we don't do that, nobody is going to do it for us. And that's the responsibility each of us holds.
Do you think that Slim, COVID-19 and the trials and tribulations that come to the fore because of COVID-19, do you think that could unintentionally, inadvertently provide the catalyst for us to create this new USP, something that binds the nation?
In the nature of things like this, when there's an immediate threat, it's very important that everybody gets behind the troops. But after the battle has started, there'll be many versions and views, which are all rightful in their own way, about how this battle should be fought. And that's the point at which we then grow apart. And we enable people to give their views and take differing, but our overall goal is then lost. And in the weeds of trying to figure out the detail, people lose the grand vision because they're so busy bickering about little things that really, in the grander scheme of things, don't matter. But the little things become the basis of bickering. And I feel we have to expect that. It's not unique to COVID. It's in everything we do. Right? If you take how we get behind our nation when they win a major rugby tournament, and we are all hallelujah for that first few days. And then we'll have our own views after that. And everybody, we can't stand together, in that kind of way for a long period. And it's going to be challenging for us to be able to do that. And we have to find it. I mean, we have to call upon our political leaders to show us the way, because sometimes we have difficulty finding it ourselves.
Do you think Slim, we sometimes expect too much from political leaders? That means, does the force not lie with the citizens outside of, Parliament?
No, absolutely. But in the citizenry, what you have is essentially the way in which we can come together. And we've been very fortunate, actually, through our anti-apartheid struggle, that we have many formations that enable us to come together, whether it's around sports or whether it's around bread and butter issues. We understand our collective strength. And that collective strength needs to be galvanized in some way. And right now, that collective strength is being utilized for many parochial things. And, I see it all the time in the university. Once you have X, you now understand that actually, now that you got X, you actually need Y, and then you need Z, and you're not thinking about all the others who haven't got to X yet. You now have a sense of what you can achieve, and you do so at the expense of others, as opposed to trying to figure out how do we all get to X, and those who've reached it, how do we help others to get there? And I have seen that in the university environment, repeatedly. That you can never, in a university setting, satisfy what all the different constituencies want. There is no way to do that in a society like ours. The demands are just beyond our ability. But instead of us understanding whatever our individual demands are, our overall demand is to have a proper functioning and effective university system. That should be the goal. But not to sacrifice that because you have your own individual interest. So when that individual interest doesn't serve the greater good, you have to weigh that up. And I see this all the time in the university sector. Every different group pulling in their own directions. It's how we have come to define it. And we know, every year we will have strife because everybody is pulling in different directions.
And that's why that phrase, Ubuntu, I am because you are, or because we are so important, or that rugby catchphrase, stronger together, I think is so profound, right? Before I wrap up, I need to ask, and I'll go to you, Quarraisha, first, about, so what is Caprisa? Because it's not COVID-19, although many people may think you've just emerged from nowhere, right? So what is Caprisa? What does Caprisa do?
Yeah, it's an acronym for the Center for the AIDS Program of Research in South Africa. It's a consortium of 5 institutions: the University of KwaZulu-Natal, University of Western Cape, University of Cape Town, the National Institutes of Communicable Diseases, and Columbia University. And it's a self-funded organization that's focused on answering 2 questions. So an overall focus on HIV/AIDS, but the 2 big challenges: how do we prevent HIV infection in young women? And 2 is, how do we prevent people dying from HIV/TB comorbidity? So we were set up just under 20 years ago with initially funding from the National Institutes of Health through a competitive grant process. We now have a diversified funding base, but we have made some progress in answering those 2 questions. And they're critical because the first question, how do we prevent infection in young women, is key to the reason why we have had so limited success in getting control of the spread of HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, notably in Southern and Eastern Africa. We see, even though we have one of the largest treatment programs in the world, we still continue to see deaths. And that's because many people are dying from co-infection with TB, and if we don't integrate those services. So as I won't bore you with the details right now, it's available, but that's what we stay focused on. So when COVID came along, as I mentioned earlier, our first thought was that, overall, we have a very young population, mainly because of the decimation of older people for the decade of delays in initiating treatment in this country resulted in people over 40 dying from AIDS. And that's slowly starting to change. But we are a young nation, but we do have huge disease burden, and most of that is from HIV and TB. And so our first thought was, well, we have a whole lot of immunosuppressed people. Not everybody is in treatment. Not everybody knows their HIV or TB status. We better start studying what this impact is going to be. And we also have to ensure that our research participants are not exposed to harm. And so we started to do some studies around COVID-19, measuring it, putting in surveillance among staff, putting in surveillance in communities we work in and facilities. And the 2 for us is we're dealing with viruses, and the viruses that are coming together. It's not like to one part of the population and not another. And you got the HIV, TB. So that's what CAPRISA is responsive primarily to the HIV epidemic. Here's our questions. But there are other factors that impact it, and we try and study those other factors, whether they're behavioral, biological, or whether it's about interventions, new interventions we need to evaluate, or available interventions be scaled up to have that impact at a population level.
Because it's interesting, now people who didn't know, I certainly did, that in fact this couple at CAPRISA, and certainly in this case Slim, Professor Karim, has got this incredible journey around HIV/AIDS, and that hopefully is coming to the fore once again to raise awareness. Slim, just your thoughts on, with hindsight, how South Africa has handled the whole issue of HIV/AIDS.
Yeah, in CAPRISA, we have our vision of a world without HIV. And in terms of trying to achieve that, we recognize the journey that has involved. And it all started some 32 years ago when we came back from New York and started doing HIV research. And at that point, we learned how HIV was disproportionately affecting young women, and we have spent our lives focusing on that. When we think about the way in which this disease has impacted our country, it is quite an astonishing tale of how we went from the depths of despair because we had so many people infected with no effective treatment. Then we had the discovery of treatments that became available, and then we couldn't afford it. So we used to go to the meetings and they would talk about these treatments, and we said, well, we don't have these treatments because they were just only available in the wealthy countries. And so I think the AIDS conference in 2000 changed that, because it made it clear that it was unconscionable, ethically unjustifiable, that where you live determines whether you live or die with this disease. And so treatment became available. Then we had to deal with the denialism period. And then we emerged from that stronger and took this on with enormous energy. And you saw that under Minister Motsoaledi, where he really pushed the energy into this program to roll out treatment. And we have so few babies now who get infected with HIV. We're on a path to eliminating that. So it just shows you how you can turn things around with the right level of commitment, taking the right approach, and ensuring you put your energy behind it and shoulder to the wheel to get the job done.
And you speak about, AIDS denialism. Obviously, our former President Thabo Mbeki's name will come up, and many others. How did you deal with, with AIDS denialism then? How are you dealing with it now?
Yeah, I'll have to be short because I have a call at 12. No, I think the period of denialism was very unfortunate in our country. It set us back. We lost momentum on a disease that we could have made a huge impact on. We created a schism between the politicians and the public, and we lost confidence in the ability of the president to lead us at a time when we most needed that leadership. And that's a big problem when you have such a situation. And I think we've emerged out of that now with a clearer understanding of how we won't do things again. It's always a learning curve. We'll make new mistakes, but we learned one set of lessons from that period. And I think as a nation, we understand the importance of accountability, and accountability not in any sort of single way, but not just accountability from our politicians to our public, but accountability from all of us, and the need for each of us to be accountable about how we are contributing to making things better.
Okay, we're gonna wrap up in a minute. I'll probably put this to both of you. Quarraisha first. You've won many awards and accolades. Which one's the most important one you've won, and how would you like to be remembered?
Yeah, so we have been fortunate in our work being recognized at many levels, nationally and globally. And I have to say this very carefully because I don't want to offend anybody who's recognized us in any way. But I think that being recognized with the Gardner Global Public Health Award is probably a sort of pinnacle award in the biomedical. And for me, the local was being inducted into the Order of Mapungubwe a couple of years back. But the key issue is that we made a difference in public health in the country, and particularly in our response to the HIV epidemic would be, I think, maybe the way to be remembered.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have any one particular award. They've all been important to me. I think, because we don't really do anything that we do for awards, they are just nice surprises that we get when we receive them. And I think it's most of our awards that Quarraisha and I have won over the years really recognize South African science. They recognize the value of the contributions that come from the global south, that come from South Africa, and that come from a part of the world where science is valued, but we don't have the kinds of resources that you have in Japan or the US or France to generate major new discoveries. And that we have been able to do that is a reflection of our science system. Not us. These are about huge collectives of people who come together to do. What we do is done by any one finding has hundreds of people behind it. So you can imagine that it's a recognition of South African science.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what, I asked you about how you like to be remembered. I think I'm not going to ask you that anymore, because you were simply going to say, we've served, and I get that, right? But I'm certainly honored that you're given of your time. Both of you very much amongst the champion people of our nation, and therefore I'm very privileged that you've been on this platform, this Champion South Africa, champion people, two important people, champion people, hopefully building this champion nation. So thank you so much, and thanks for giving up your time.
Great pleasure.
Thanks, Asha.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Well, there you are. So two champion people. Think about this. Professor Abdool Karim from Caprisa, and a member of the advisory committee to the Minister of Health around COVID-19. And then the other person, Professor Abdool Karim, a member of Caprisa, part of the advisory committee to the Minister of Health around COVID-19. Definitely two of South Africa's champion people.